Well, welcome to the PowerPoint on the policies and programs for children and families from Karger and Stowitz. This PowerPoint will look at some of the historical factors as well as some of the important policies that have helped shape children and families in the American society. So these chapters examine basically the evolution of the child welfare policies regarding child protective services, foster care, adoptions, and Head Start. They've all been the focus of child welfare policies basically since about the 1960s, according to Karger and Stowitz. So there's a progression of the child welfare policies, and how it's important to understand that is that what's happened in the past brings up all the way to today, and it impacts our work in the helping profession even today. So back in the 1860s, the first child was identified as being an indentured servant, basically someone who was cared for by another family in which they were not born. And so they would usually generally work for this family and be sometimes considered just a worker or a slave or someone that was not necessarily part of the family. But as time went on, many children were found to be on the streets, particularly in New York. And, and there was a huge increase of petty crime and homelessness. And so one man questioned to see what can be done with this. Now we're a country, we've been in existence for a while, but we have this social problem. And so there's a link there to explore more about what's called the orphan trains. But essentially, a man named Charles Loring Brace was a pastor who had a heart for caring for these kids who were running the streets. And he believed that all children have a right to have a family. And he had a plan to help solve this social issue. So see the link more about the orphan trains. Then a few years later, in 1873, there's a little girl named Mary Ellen, and she was discovered being abused. Again, there's a link there, so take some time to watch the video. It's about an author who wrote the story of Mary Ellen and how the beginning of the Child Protective Services as we know it today began from the New York Society of Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, became the Society of Prevention of Cruelty to Children. And so some of the key players that was involved in that. So here's a little disclaimer about this little link, is that I'm not endorsing or saying that you have to buy this book specifically, but just to let you know that there are some really excellent books out there that tells this story. And then you can kind of see and listen to the video. I know it's a little bit long, but he does a clear explanation of that historical event. Then as time progresses on the timeline of 1899, the first juvenile courts were established since there were a number of cases involving children, and the idea began that these kids should not be treated the same as adults. And so the first court that occurred was in Cook County in Chicago, Illinois. And then in 1935, Roosevelt's New Deal, the Social Security Act, was passed. And this was significant because now there was money allocated to train people to work with this population, and they used federal funds. So as time passed in the 1960s then surfaced, and it was a time that everyone wanted to have the rights. There was a big change in American society. Civil rights progressed, women's rights. Everybody was going on saying, we need our rights, and rightly so. But in particular for children's rights, there was a huge change. And so there was a lot of laws that started to take place into how to care for children. Then in the next decade, in the 1970s, the policies were passed which addressed the process of reporting child abuse and what to look for, and then what is the procedure and what to do. And children were being removed and not returned to their families. So what developed was that children were remaining in out-of-home placements or foster care. And if it wasn't working out in this home, then they would move to the next home. And if it wasn't working out to that home, they'd move to the next one. And that became known as the foster care drift. Kids were drifting from one home to the next. Then comes the 80s. Okay, in the 1980s, it was a change that was made to work to reunify those families that were drifting from one home to another, and give attention to try to work to see how we can keep or return them back to their children. And if not, then the children were needing to be adopted if it didn't work out for them to go back to their home. Then in the 1990s, a new movement surfaced, which tried to preserve the family and to keep the children in the home even before that they could be removed. And this new movement was referred to as family preservation. And there was an increase of federal dollars to help support the family. If they needed beds, or if they needed some electricity fixed, so wires fixed so they could have electricity in their home, then these monies were allocated for these practical means to help improve their living conditions. Then there was, in the 1997, a famous policy was called the Adoption Safe Families Act, and it's also known as ASFA. And this is where they set up a plan for each child to have less time in foster care and to go and have a direct plan of adoptions for permanency, which would be, of course, the first choice being with the relative. So the time shift changed to say, okay, if we're going to try to reunify, but at the same time, if we can't reunify, we're going to start finding an adoptive home, whether that's a relative or whether that's somebody else. So if at that time, then instead of waiting 2 years and then starting to find an adoptive home, by that time the child is 2 years older, and in terms of their ability to connect and grow with a family, this law said we're going to find a home. So within the 6 months or 12 months at the most, then we will place this child in an adoptive home if it doesn't work out returning back to their biological family. And that is called concurrent planning. So 2 plans at the same time. Very important key legislations that occurred for the foster care. So just as a review of terms, then family preservations would be a good, make sure you understand that. Family reunification, meaning returning to the family. And then permanency planning, just as it entails, is planning on a long-term plan for this. And of course, then foster care is what's considered as an out-of-home placement, which could also be a relative placement, but we also have kinship care, which will cover that. So who is basically in care? Well, the government, U.S. government, has a report that they statistically keep stats on all of the kids known in foster care. And we call that the Adoption and Foster Care Analysis and Reporting System. So there's a link there too on this slide to click on for the latest information, and it's a government website. And so usually the reports are about 1 year behind or so in terms of availability, but it gives you an idea as to what's out there. So take some time to look at that report, see what ethnicities are there, what ages are there, what the reasons are, what their permanency plan is, and be familiar with some of the numbers of the types of children in foster care in the United States. So just because we talk about removing a child, just to let you know that the decision to remove a child is an extreme one. It's not easy. As a social worker myself, I've had to make that decision to remove the child. But we have to remember that removing the child from their home is the last option, but definitely an option if the child is in immediate danger. And currently many counties have a model in place of what's called structured decision making. In other words, a social worker does not go into the home and think, oh, I'm just going to remove these kids, or wake up one day and say, oh, I feel like removing kids today. No, it doesn't work that way. There's a process in place that if the criteria is met that the child is not being safe under this model, then the answer would be yes to remove and kind of decide. If the answer is no, then what services need to be in place to be able to help support this family. So there's a process or a flow chart. So sometimes in TVs and shows, it looks like, oh yeah, it's just social workers come in just to remove the children. But there's a process and a legal system in place. And it's all about the safety and permanency of a child. So then the type of available foster care facilities, obviously one is a relative, would be kinship care. And so they can also, under the Adoption Safe Families Act of 1997, a new term called a non-related extended family member, try to say that 3 times fast, but is available for, maybe it's a non-related, maybe it is a church member at a certain church who knows his family, knows his kid since birth, but they're not blood, they're not related, but they are connected to the family. And so they can be then approved as a non-related extended family member as the same equality as being a relative in kinship care. If no one's available, then it could be then in a foster family home, which they're not related, and that's designed to be temporary. Then you have group homes and then residential treatment centers if those don't work out. And so there's a progression from smaller or to most homes that are needed would have the most treatment. Usually it's affiliated with the progression of perhaps difficulty in behavior, being able to stay in the same home. So here's permanency planning once again. And make sure you have a pretty good understanding of what permanency planning is, because it's just as what the name states. It's a plan to come up with the most permanent home for a family. And foster homes are designed to be temporary, and then placing with a relative demonstrates a more permanent place to live. So the next few slides 8 to 17, show some key child welfare policies that have been passed that have made a great impact in the care of foster children in out-of-home placement. And so look through those and read. Those are key ones that have made some huge changes in the care of foster kids. The Adoption Safe Families Act of 1997, which is ASFA that I referred to. And that has the key components is looking at the safety, permanency of the children. So take a look at these, the legal framework. Basically, in order for a child to be adopted, they have to be freed from adoption. So that actually means they have to terminate, is what the word is, terminate the parental rights of the parent. And in order to be able to do that, a permanent plan has to be in place first in terms of an adoptive family or a relative willing to adopt. The Adoption Assistance and Child Welfare Act of 1980 allowed for monies to be allocated to families who were taking in kids. As we all know, having kids, it costs money to feed, to clothe, for water, electricity. And so people needed to have, that were willing to open their homes to kids. They said, well, we'd love to have kids, but we just can't afford another mouth to feed. And so the government allocated dollars to help supplement families that once they would take a child for foster care and then actually go to adoptions, then to continue with that money until they turn 18. And so it wasn't a hindrance to say, well, I'll take them temporarily, but just not permanently. So it was a way to work on that permanency. There's also the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act of 1994. Make sure you're familiar with that and what that one says in terms of the ethnic identification of the child, as well as the ethnic identity of the placement of the family. And then the ASFA, Adoption Safe Families Act of 1994. So some some trends and issues that are constantly in discussion is open and closed adoptions. How do we support families with special needs? Now there's also about autistic children. There are various issues that keep getting addressed, and so be aware of some. Now on to Head Start. In January of 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson declared what's identified as the War on Poverty in his State of the Union speech. And part of the government's thinking on poverty was influenced by new research on the effects of poverty. So as well as the impacts of how poverty affects the process of education. So this research that was developed said, well, we have an obligation to help disadvantaged groups. The more support that disadvantaged groups or people in poverty have, the more likely they're going to have education, and the more likely then they're going to be able to lead productive lives and not repeat the cycle of poverty, where they can now be able to get education and raise out of that. So Head Start was designed to help break that cycle of poverty and provide preschool children of low-income families with a comprehensive program to meet their emotional, social, health, nutritional, and psychological needs. And so there's some links here that I want you to look at and to understand what Head Start is all about. Now, over the number of years, there's some opposition to this program of Head Start, and I think it's a good idea as people in the helping profession to have an understanding of this controversy. Some are pro Head Start and some are against. And so whatever position you decide that you are a part of, it's good to have an understanding of the both sides. So click on the links to learn more about the Head Start program.